Okay, so I'm going to talk about the later phase of the reign of Edward the Confessor now. This is the period from 1053 through to 1056. As we looked at last time, 1052 is the return of the Godwin family. The Godwin family returns from exile, and this is really the great victory of Earl Godwin. But for Godwin himself, this victory is going to be short-lived, as he dies in 1053. And with the death of Godwin, we really see a shift in the relationship, I feel, between Edward and the Godwin family, and also a shift in Edward's policy towards his kingdom. His ideas about kingship perhaps change at this time. On the death of Godwin, Harold, Godwinson, succeeds to the Earldom of Wessex, and he's going to become really the most important magnate in Edward's court from this point onwards. Slightly problematic when we look at Edward's later reign, in that one of the major sources for this period is called the Vita Edward Regis. This is the life of King Edward. This book was commissioned by Edith of Wessex, and it's essentially a hagiography of Edward. This is where we get lots of ideas about Edward's piety and his relationship and the importance he places on his relationship with God, placing this above his relationship with his wife and above his relationship with his kingdom. Interestingly as well, as she is the sister, of course, of the Godwin sons, there is a lot written in praise of Harold and particularly of Tostig. So it's important to bear this in mind when we're thinking about how we piece this period together. But I think we can certainly say that during this time, Edward's involvement with frontline politics, with frontline kingship, this decreases, and he seems to delegate more and more to the Godwin sons, particularly Harold. We'll speak about that shortly. However, I think it's possible to overstate this, and there's one instance I want to talk about in particular which suggests that Edward was still fighting in this later part of his reign, and this is where he invites Edward the Exile and Edgar the Atheling over to England in 1057. Edward the Exile is the son of Edward's half-brother, Edmund Ironsides, and he's been in exile a long time in Hungary, since well before Edward the Confessor was in Normandy, in fact. He invites them back, Edward invites them back, and it seems to make sense that he's thinking about the succession. We'll talk about this when I talk about the succession crisis. But crucially, what happens in a mirror of what happens in 1036 when Edward's brother Alfred comes over. Alfred, of course, is killed, blinded so carelessly he dies, and Godwin is implicated in this. Edward the Exile dies shortly after arriving in England. We don't know how. Personally, I would tend to imagine that Harold has got a hand in this, but it's pure conjecture. Edgar the Atheling does survive. He makes it to court, and so we have at this point a potential young successor to Edward. He is too young to succeed Edward at this point. So bear this in mind when we think about the growing power of the Godwin family. But there's no doubt that the Godwin family are increasing in power all of the time. If we think about the earldoms, when Siward dies, he's the Earl of Northumbria, he dies. Tostig, Harold's brother, succeeds to this earldom. Harold's other brothers, Leofwine and Gyrth, they both accede to their own earldoms. The Godwin family are now essentially in control of a huge area of England, You still have Earl Edwin in Mercia, but the other major earldoms are controlled by the Godwin sons at this point. Harold himself is referred to quite often as subregulus, as junior king at this point. And this is perhaps really sort of well exemplified by King Griffith of Wales is causing trouble, as he often does throughout our period, on the borders, and it is Edward sends Harold and Tostig to deal with this, and in 1063 it's Harold and Tostig who are leading the fight against the Welsh here. This is the duty of the medieval king. He should be there on the front line. If you think about what happens at Hastings, for example, Harold is standing there at the front line at Stamford Bridge, then at Hastings. This is the duty, really, of a medieval king, and Edward is passing this on. He may have been sick by this point. He may have been unable to do it. So this is complex. Edward, of course, is famous at this time for his hunting. He's the royal chase. He's increasing the size of the royal chase to hunt on. And of course, he's also rebuilding Westminster Abbey. This is the great Romanesque abbey that is really Edward's incredible physical legacy. Then we get 1065, and this is a crucial year for us. So in 1065 in Northumbria, the people of Northumbria raise up and they rebel against Tostig. He's accused of being too harsh. Edward sends Harold to deal with this. So Harold is sent to deal with his own brother. And Harold essentially sides with the rebels, and Tostig is exiled. When we come to look at the Battle of Hastings and what happens there, of course, this is crucial. Tostig famously travels abroad. He travels to different kingdoms and tries to raise an army to come back and re-seize his position. And we'll look at that again. Interestingly, Edward is said to be furious about this. He didn't want Tostig exiled. This is going against Edward's own wishes. Edward has made Tostig the Earl. And it's important to bear this in mind, this relationship between the kings and the earls. It's a relationship of reciprocity. There's no attempt by any of these earls to overthrow Edward himself. This doesn't happen, not even in 1052. There's no suggestion that the Godwin family is going to replace Edward. But Harold exiles his brother. Harold makes the judgment call. Harold is certainly at this point, he's got his eye on the throne. And I think he probably suspects Tostig is doing the same thing. So he exiles his brother. Interestingly, really interesting choice of words in the Vita Edward at this point. Edward is described as impotent. He is impotent, he is powerless. So at 1065, towards the end of his reign, Edward is powerless to do anything about this. Edward then seems to have probably suffered a series of strokes before finally falling ill and passing away. And then when we look at the succession crisis, I'll talk more about this. But it seems almost certain that at his deathbed, he names Harold Godwinson, the son of his great rival Godwin, who is still his brother-in-law. He is named as his successor, and of course Harold succeeds to the throne of England in early 1066.